Marguerite, put the resident folder down and step back from the drawer.
About what? I'm not sure what you need from
The
me.
forged checks from your memory care residents.
For 13 years, Marguerite Devlin was trusted to care for patients who could no longer protect themselves. What investigators found in her home after her arrest confirmed she had been stealing from them the entire time, including from one resident who had been dead for 18 months.
I don't remember any of that. I handle a lot of care files.
Checks payable to you during documented cognitive decline.
I genuinely do not remember that, and I'm not going to say I did something I don't.
She would not get to finish that sentence. Within 72 hours, sheriff's investigators would walk out of her single-story house on Birchwood Lane carrying 22 checkbooks. 11 belonged to current Heartshade Senior Living residents. 10 belonged to former residents. And 1 belonged to a man who had been dead for 18 months. 12 victims. 4 years. $580,000 drained from people whose own physicians had certified, in writing, on the very days the checks were signed, that they could not possibly have written them. Before we go any further, I have to ask you something. Have you ever trusted someone to care for an elderly parent and wondered, just for a moment, what they actually did when no one was watching? Drop a comment and tell me. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. We cover the people who weaponize trust against the most defenseless victims in this country every single week, and this one ranks among the worst we have ever documented. Marguerite Ann Devlin was born in 1973 in Heartshade, Vermont, a town of 1,900 people tucked into the eastern foothills of the Green Mountains. The kind of place where the same families have lived on the same dairy roads for 4 generations. Her father, Royce Devlin, worked the maintenance shop at the Heartshade Town Highway Department. Her mother, Audrey, kept the books for a feed and grain supplier 2 counties over in St. Johnsbury. They lived in a clapboard house on Maple Hollow Road with a wood stove in the kitchen and a root cellar that flooded every March. She was the middle of 3 girls. The older sister became a high school music teacher in Burlington. The younger sister took a job with the state agriculture department. Marguerite was the one who stayed. She graduated from Heartshade Union High School in 1991, ranked 22nd in a class of 58. Her yearbook listed her activities as choir, the Future Nurses Club, and 2 years on the junior varsity field hockey team. The career path was set early. Her maternal grandmother, Vivian Lamoureux, had moved into the family home in 1987 after a stroke left her partially paralyzed. Marguerite was 14 years old when she started helping with the daily routine: bathing, dressing, walking her grandmother from the bedroom to the kitchen and back. By the time Vivian died in 1993, Marguerite had been the primary caregiver in everything but title for nearly 6 years, and she had decided, somewhere in those years, that elder care was what she wanted to do with her life. She enrolled in the licensed practical nursing program at Vermont Technical College in Randolph in the fall of 1993. The program ran 15 months. She completed clinical rotations at 3 regional facilities, including a long-term care unit at Gifford Medical Center in Randolph. Her clinical evaluations described her as calm under pressure, attentive to bathing and toileting protocols, and showing strong patience with confused or combative patients. Her supervising preceptor wrote that she had a genuine vocation for geriatric nursing. She earned her LPN license from the Vermont Board of Nursing in March of 1995. She was 22 years old. The first decade of her career was unremarkable in the best sense. She worked 9 years on the night shift at a 50-bed long-term care facility in Lyndonville. She married a man named Curtis Bissett in 1999. She divorced him in 2007. No children. She moved back to Heartshade after the divorce and bought a single-story ranch house on Birchwood Lane with the divorce settlement. 3/4 of an acre, a detached garage, a fenced vegetable garden in the back. In November of 2010, she applied for an open LPN position at Heartshade Senior Living, a 48-bed assisted living and memory care community that had opened on the south side of town 2 years earlier. She was hired on a Tuesday and started the following Monday. Her starting wage was $19.40 an hour. Her offer letter described her assignment as the memory care wing, a secured 26-bed unit for residents with progressive dementia diagnoses. Her first annual evaluation in 2011 described her as reliable, soft-spoken, exceptionally patient with agitated residents, and a calming presence on a difficult unit. Her second evaluation noted that she had voluntarily picked up additional weekend shifts and was being considered for a charge nurse role on the memory care side. By 2014, she was the senior LPN on the wing. She was, by every appearance, exactly the person you would want caring for your mother. The memory care wing at Heartshade Senior Living occupies the entire east end of the building. A keypad-secured double door at the main hallway separates it from the assisted living side. Inside, 26 private rooms run along a U-shaped corridor that loops back to a central nursing station, a small dining area, and an activities room with a piano nobody plays. The residents of that wing share a single diagnostic category: progressive dementia, Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal dementia. The specific etiology varies. The trajectory does not. Every resident on the wing is, by definition, losing the cognitive function required to manage their own affairs. That is the entry criterion. That is the reason they are there. For the families who place a parent in memory care, the math is brutal. The resident can no longer be safely left alone. The family cannot provide 24-hour supervision. The facility exists to substitute for the supervision the family cannot give, and the resident can no longer give themselves. The monthly cost in Vermont in 2020 ran between $7,500 and $12,000, depending on care level. Families paid it because there was no other option. The clinical structure of the unit operated on a continuous documentation framework. Every interaction was logged. Medication administration, behavioral observations, eating and toileting patterns, cognitive status. Every nurse on every shift entered notes into the facility's electronic medical record system, an Epic-based platform with timestamps, identity logs, and audit trails. The progress notes generated over 13 years of continuous documentation on 26 residents, represented one of the most detailed clinical archives of cognitive decline available anywhere outside an academic research setting. The financial side of resident life was structured around the same vulnerability. Most residents had granted durable power of attorney to an adult child before their decline progressed too far. The POA holder received monthly statements, paid the facility, and managed the residents' investments and estate. But a number of residents had moved into memory care while still possessing some semblance of independent banking. Several kept personal checkbooks in their rooms, not for active use, for the comfort of the routine. Sitting at their bedside table with the checkbook open and a pen in hand was, for some, a calming ritual that mimicked decades of independent adult life. Family members had been advised by social workers to remove the checkbooks. Most had not. The checkbooks felt like dignity. Taking them away felt like cruelty. The audit framework on the resident side was thin. A handful of accounts were monitored monthly by attentive POA holders. The rest were checked at tax time, or at the death of the resident, or when the family happened to think to look. The facility itself had no responsibility for monitoring residents' personal banking. That was, explicitly, the family's job. For 13 years on that wing, Marguerite Devlin watched that system from the inside. She started small. The first transaction Vermont investigators would later confirm as fraudulent was dated March 14th, 2020. A check for $240 drawn on the personal account of a 78-year-old resident named Howard Beaumont, payable to Mimps Devlin, with a memo line that read, in handwriting that was not Howard Beaumont's, the words personal care reimbursement. Howard Beaumont had been admitted to the memory care wing 14 months earlier with a diagnosis of moderate-stage Alzheimer's disease. His clinical progress note for March 14th, 2020, documented that he had been unable, that morning, to identify the current month, the current year, or the name of his deceased wife of 51 years. The check cleared 3 days later. Nobody noticed. The method, once she established it, did not change in 4 years. She accessed the checkbooks during routine care interactions, medication rounds, bathing, dressing, helping a resident from the bed to the wheelchair. She would open the bedside table drawer where the checkbook lived. She would carry a check or two out of the room in the cargo pocket of her scrubs. She would fill in the payee, the date, and the amount in her own handwriting in private. She would forge the resident's signature using exemplars she had studied off legitimate documents stored in the resident's own room. Birthday cards to grandchildren that family members had brought during visits. Photo album inscriptions. The occasional preserved letter from a long-dead spouse. She would deposit the checks through the drive-through window at Northfield Savings Bank's Heartshade branch, 2 miles from the facility, on her way home from the night shift. The escalation followed the same pattern federal investigators have documented in dozens of elder financial exploitation cases. The first thefts were small and infrequent. $240, $300. The first 6 months produced approximately $11,000 total, drawn from 3 residents. When none of those thefts triggered any inquiry from any family member, she expanded. By the end of 2020, she was working from 6 residents' checkbooks. By the end of 2021, she was working from 9. The dollar amounts climbed in parallel. $500, $800, $1,200. She kept the recurring small checks calibrated against each resident's historical spending pattern. A resident who had subscribed to a quilting magazine for 40 years would now appear to be making small, irregular payments to a craft supply payee. A resident who had given $50 a month to her church would now appear to be giving small, irregular amounts to a different and entirely fictitious charity. The genius of the fraud, if it can be called that, was that the activity she generated looked exactly like the activity a confused dementia patient would generate if left to manage her own checkbook. Erratic, small, inconsistent. The kind of thing a busy adult child reviewing a monthly statement would shake their head at, sigh, and chalk up to mom's confusion. For residents whose families were geographically distant and whose POA oversight was loose or non-existent, she went bigger. A resident named Eleanor Whitmer, 84, vascular dementia, daughter living in Phoenix and visiting twice a year, had her account drained of $19,000 across 11 checks between June of 2021 and February of 2023. 3 of those checks were written for amounts between $5,000 and $10,000. The clinical progress notes for the days those checks were signed documented that Mrs. Whitmer could not identify the season, could not name her daughter, and could not, on one of the transaction dates, remember that her husband had died 8 years earlier. A resident named Calvin Bourne, 81, late-stage Alzheimer's, no living children, and no active power of attorney, had $87,000 removed from his personal account between September of 2021 and his death in October of 2022. After his death, his nephew in Connecticut received a letter from the facility stating that no personal effects remained to be returned. The nephew accepted this without question. He had not spoken to his uncle in 7 years. Marguerite Devlin kept Calvin Bourne's checkbook. She continued writing checks against his closed estate accounts for 6 months after he died. By the spring of 2023, she had drained money from 12 residents. The cumulative total had crossed $500,000. She had bought herself nothing flashy. No new car, no vacation home, no jewelry. The money went to a personal investment account with a Burlington brokerage, a series of certificates of deposit at 3 different Vermont credit unions, and a modest renovation of the kitchen at the house on Birchwood Lane. She was a careful woman with old, careful tastes. She was not stealing to be rich. She was stealing because she could. The unraveling began with a tax return. In January of 2024, a software engineer named Jameson Pell, who lived in Bellevue, Washington, sat down at his kitchen table with a stack of printed bank statements and began assembling tax documentation for his mother. His mother was Geraldine Pell, 80, an 18-month resident of the Heartshade Senior Living Memory Care Wing, diagnosed with moderate Alzheimer's disease following the death of her husband in 2021. Jameson Pell held durable power of attorney over his mother's accounts. He had set up monthly transfers from her main checking account to cover the facility fees. He paid her property taxes on the house in Hartshade that had stood empty since her admission. He filed her returns. He was, by the standard of out-of-state adult children of memory care residents, an attentive and conscientious son. He had not, however, been reviewing his mother's personal checking account line by line each month. He had been checking the balance, confirming the facility transfer had cleared, and moving on with his life. For the tax review, he needed the year's full transaction history. He pulled 12 statements from the bank's online portal and printed them. He laid them out on the kitchen table in order. He started in January and worked forward. The first anomaly appeared in the February statement. A check for $320 written to Monsieur Devlin with a memo line reading personal care. Jameson read it twice. He set the statement aside and pulled March. 2 more checks to Ms. Devlin, $410, $275. He pulled April, 3 checks. He pulled May, 5 checks. By the time he reached November, he was looking at a 6-month pattern of small unexplained checks payable to M. Devlin, plus a single transfer of $7,800 in October to a payee he did not recognize. His mother could not have written those checks. He knew this with the certainty of a man who had watched his mother lose the ability to remember his name. He called the facility on a Monday morning. The administrator on duty told him there was no Monsieur Devlin employed at the facility in any administrative capacity who would have any legitimate reason to receive personal payments from a resident. He asked who else was named Devlin at the facility. The administrator paused. There was an LPN on the memory care wing named Marguerite Devlin, the administrator said. Senior LPN. 13 years. Jameson Pell hung up the phone. He spent the next 40 minutes locating the contact information for the Vermont Adult Protective Services hotline and the Financial Crimes Unit of the County Sheriff's Office. He called both. He emailed both. He overnighted copies of his mother's bank statements to both. By Thursday of that week, an investigator from the Sheriff's Department had opened a case file with the working title, Devlin Financial Exploitation, Hartshade Senior Living. The investigator's name was Detective Sergeant Brenna Cassidy. She had spent 11 years on the Financial Crimes Unit and had worked cases involving every species of trust betrayal Vermont could produce. She had not seen one of these in a while. She knew, before she had read 3 pages of the bank statements Jameson Pell had sent, that she was going to be busy for a long time. Detective Sergeant Cassidy's first move was the subpoena. She did not subpoena Marguerite Devlin's accounts. Not yet. She subpoenaed the bank records of every resident on the Hartshade Senior Living Memory Care Wing. All 26, 6 months on either side of the Pell transactions. The subpoenas went out on a Tuesday in late January. The first responses came back within 10 days. By the end of February, she had a stack of bank records covering 26 residents over 30 months. She built a spreadsheet. She isolated every check across the entire data set that was payable to MC Devlin, or to Marguerite Devlin, or to any payee Cassidy could not immediately verify as a real and legitimate vendor. The spreadsheet, by mid-March, had 347 entries spread across 12 residents. The total was $460,000 and climbing. There were going to be more. Her second move was the request to Hartshade Senior Living for the clinical progress notes of those 12 residents over the relevant date range. The facility complied within 10 business days. The notes arrived in 3 encrypted electronic batches, totaling more than 14,000 pages of clinical documentation. This was the move that would close the case. Cassidy partnered with a forensic accountant on loan from the Vermont Attorney General's office and a consulting geriatric neuropsychologist from Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center. They took every confirmed fraudulent transaction. They identified the date the check was signed. They pulled the clinical progress note documenting that resident's cognitive status on that same date. They asked the neuropsychologist a single question for each pairing. Could this resident, on this date, have understood and authored a check of this complexity? The answer, in every case, was no. We are about to walk into the courtroom. Before we do, take a second to leave a comment letting me know where you are watching from, and consider subscribing if you have not already. Stories like this one do not get the attention they deserve from mainstream media, and we cover them here every single week. The verdict in this one is going to surprise some of you, and the sentence is going to make a few of you angry. Stay with me. The clinical notes had been written by treating clinicians who did not know they were creating the most damning prosecution exhibit in the financial crimes career of Detective Sergeant Cassidy. They had simply been doing their jobs, documenting the daily reality of progressive dementia. The notes recorded that residents could not identify the year, could not name their spouse, could not recognize their own children, could not, on the dates checks were forged in their names, perform basic arithmetic, or read aloud from a printed page. The neuropsychologist's report ran to 280 pages. Its summary was 4 sentences. None of the 12 residents on any of the transaction dates possessed the cognitive capacity required to understand the nature of a personal check. None possessed the executive function required to assemble the dollar amount and payee with intent. None possessed the procedural memory required to reproduce their own signature with the inconsistency observed in the questioned exemplars. The transactions charged to their accounts were authored by another hand. By April, Cassidy had her search warrant. On the morning of April 11th, 2024, 6 sheriff's deputies and 2 forensic accountants executed a search of the single-story house on Birchwood Lane. They were inside for 9 hours. They left with 3 boxes of evidence. The boxes contained 22 checkbooks. Bank statements for 3 accounts at 3 Vermont credit unions in the name of Marguerite A. Devlin, holding a combined $417,000. A Burlington brokerage statement showing an additional $110,000 in mutual fund holdings. A spiral notebook in which Devlin had recorded, in tidy script, running totals of cash withdrawals against each resident's account, organized by resident initials. And, in the top drawer of a wooden dresser in the spare bedroom, the checkbook of Calvin Bourne. 18 months after his death. The checkbook of a man whose nephew had been told no personal effects remained. She was at the nursing station when they came for her. The afternoon shift had just begun. She was charting morning medications into the Epic system. Her hair was pulled back, her badge clipped to the collar of her navy blue scrubs, a paper cup of cafeteria coffee on the counter beside the keyboard. Through the corridor to her right, a resident named Margaret Quinlan was being walked back to her room by a CNA after the day's first activity period. Detective Sergeant Cassidy walked through the keypad door at 3:12 in the afternoon, accompanied by 2 uniformed deputies and the facility's administrator. Cassidy stopped at the nursing station. She did not raise her voice. Cassidy. Marguerite Devlin? Devlin looked up from the screen. Devlin. Yes. Cassidy. I'm Detective Sergeant Brenna Cassidy with the County Sheriff's Department. I need to speak with you in the administrator's office. Please come with me. Devlin's hand froze on the mouse. The color left her face in a way that 2 of the responding deputies would later describe in identical language. They both wrote that her face went completely white. She stood up. She walked with them through the keypad door, down the corridor, into the administrator's office. The door closed behind them. She sat in a chair across from the administrator's desk. Detective Cassidy sat across from her. The deputies remained standing. Cassidy opened a manila folder. Cassidy. Ms. Devlin, we executed a search warrant at your residence on Birchwood Lane this morning. Devlin said nothing. Cassidy. During the search, we recovered 22 checkbooks. 11 of them belong to current residents of this facility. 10 belong to former residents. 1 of them belonged to Calvin Bourne, who died here in October of 2022. Devlin's eyes did not move from the folder. Cassidy. We also recovered a notebook in your kitchen that appears to document running totals of cash withdrawals against the personal accounts of 12 residents on this wing, organized by their initials. Do you know what document I'm describing? Devlin. I want a lawyer. Cassidy. That's your right, Ms. Devlin. You're under arrest for vulnerable adult financial exploitation and forgery. Stand up, please. She stood up. She turned around without being asked. She put her hands behind her back. The senior deputy snapped the cuffs closed and read her the Miranda warning from a printed card. She did not speak again on facility property. The Vermont Superior Court arraigned Marguerite Devlin on April 12, 2024, on charges of vulnerable adult abuse, financial, under Title 33, Section 6913 of the Vermont Statutes Annotated, multiple counts of forgery under 13 VSA, Section 1801, theft, aggregated, and one federal count of aggravated identity theft under 18 U.S.C. Section 1028A, transferred to the state proceeding by joint agreement of the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Vermont Attorney General. She was held on a $200,000 surety bond. She did not post it. Her defense attorney was a Burlington-based criminal defense lawyer named Edmund Pritchard. His strategy was the only strategy available to him given the evidence. He would argue that the prosecution could not definitively prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the handwriting on the checks was Devlin's, and he would attempt to introduce a question of whether the residents themselves, in moments of partial lucidity, might have written the checks. The trial began in September of 2024 in the Caledonia County Courthouse in St. Johnsbury. It lasted 11 days. The prosecution called 27 witnesses, including Detective Sergeant Cassidy, the forensic accountant, the Dartmouth neuropsychologist, the Northfield Savings Bank branch manager, 4 POA holding adult children of affected residents, and a handwriting expert from the Vermont State Police. The defense theory collapsed in the second week. The handwriting expert presented side-by-side comparisons of 50 forged signatures and confirmed exemplars from each of the 12 residents. The inconsistencies were systematic and identifiable across the entire dataset. The signatures on the questioned checks had been produced by a single common hand, and that hand was not the hand of any of the 12 residents. The neuropsychologist took the stand for 2 days. He walked the jury through the clinical progress note comparison for each resident on each transaction date. He explained, in clear language, a jury of Vermont laypeople could absorb that the patients to whom these checks were attributed were, on the dates in question, no longer cognitively capable of the activity charged to their accounts. The defense did not call Devlin to testify. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Sentencing was held on November 14th, 2024. The presiding judge was the Honorable Margaret Ouellette of Caledonia County Superior Court. Before sentencing, she heard victim impact statements from 4 families. The longest was delivered by Jameson Pell, whose tax return